Well, thank you, and God bless the Campaign for Liberty. Now, I recognize I have the wonderful distinction of being the last speaker standing between you and the bar. So I appreciate those of y'all who are still here, and even more, I appreciate those of y'all who started early. You know, last year, I gave kind of a long speech on the Senate floor. And in the course of 21 hours, you try to find some topics to capture people's interest, to make them turn on the television, to make them listen to the disaster that is Obamacare. So I did a little bit of Dr. Seuss. I told some Duck Dynasty jokes. I read long sections from Atlas Shrugged. Well, that next weekend, Saturday Night Live, on their news session, brought up the speech and said, Senator Ted Cruz went to the Senate floor and gave a speech where he talked about Darth Vader, White Castle hamburgers, and green eggs and ham. We don't know what the topic was, but we're pretty sure it was legalizing pot. And there are aspects of politics that are sometimes a little unusual. I don't know how many of y'all watch the HBO show True Blood? So it's a vampire show. And a few weeks back, much to my astonishment, they featured the vampires going to a Ted Cruz fundraiser. I'm not making this up. This was a real episode on HBO. They go to the Ted Cruz fundraiser, and I'm sorry if this is a plot spoiler, but they end up killing as many people as possible at the fundraiser. It's HBO. So, you know, we decided to have a little bit of fun with it. So we posted something about the episode on Facebook, and I said, you know, if I were to sit down and make a list of all the places I never thought to see my name mentioned, HBO's vampire show, True Blood, would be really near the top of that list. And I went on to say, listen, I'm very, very sorry to have apparently lost the vampire vote. But I am at least amused and somewhat astonished that HBO seems to be suggesting that hardcore leftists are blood-sucking fiends. So we put that up on Facebook. A whole bunch of people began commenting back and forth. And the very best comment came from one fellow on Facebook who said, Ted, I'm sorry to tell you, you never had the vampire vote. Because vampires are dead. And everyone knows the dead vote 100% Democrat. Which we promptly tweeted out to the whole world. We crowdsourced the joke and we ran with it. You know, today is the 70th anniversary of Hayek's publishing The Road to Serfdom. 70 years ago today in the United States, The Road to Serfdom was published. You think of the journey we have traveled in those 70 years. If he thought we were facing totalitarian serfdom then, imagine where we are now. What I want to speak to you all tonight about is defending the Constitution. A passion of every man and woman here, a passion of mine my entire life, and I'll tell you there is no time when our Constitution has been more imperiled, in greater jeopardy than it is right now today. You know, it is almost as if this administration is going down the Bill of Rights, trying to violate each and every one of them. You take the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. There's never been an administration more hostile to the Second Amendment than this administration. I'll tell you, in Texas, we define gun control as hitting what you aim at. And we all remember last year coming out of the horrific shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, when all of the mainstream media was convinced that the president's so-called gun control agenda was unstoppable. And I'll tell you, I was proud to stand alongside my friend Rand Paul and my friend Mike Lee, helping lead the fight on the Senate floor to protect our Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. The three of us sent a letter to Harry Reid that said we will filibuster any legislation that undermines the Second Amendment. And then what happened was each of you. What happened was the American people began to stand up and call their senators, began to show up and go to town hall meetings and say, they're fighting for the Second Amendment. What's wrong with you? How come you're not protecting our constitutional rights? And when it came time for a vote, every single proposal of this administration to undermine the Second Amendment was voted down on the Senate floor. That was your victory. That was the power of the grassroots of the people holding our elected officials accountable. You look at the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, our right to privacy. How many of y'all have your cell phones with you tonight? Let me ask you, please leave your cell phones on. I want to make sure President Obama hears every word we say tonight. And you know, part of the Fifth Amendment is the right that protects our life, liberty, and property from being taken without due process of law. And you look at things like, for example, the militarization of police. As police officers are supposed to protect and serve, come dressed when confronting American citizens like they're confronting a hostile army. That's not the way it's supposed to work. You look at the 10th Amendment, or as President Obama calls it, the what? The fundamental protection that says the powers not given to the federal government are reserved to the states or to the people. It means there are certain powers given to the federal government that are few and defined and that should do them well. And everything else is out of Washington. It means areas like education, and we should repeal every word of Common Core. Education is too important to have it dictated by unelected bureaucrats out of Washington. It ought to be at the state level or even better at the local level. And besides, we already have a Common Core in this country. It's called the U.S. Constitution. Or you take the First Amendment. The assault of this administration on free speech and religious liberty is unparalleled. The IRS demanding of citizen groups, tell us what books you're reading. Tell us the content of your prayers. You know what? The federal government has no business asking any American the content of our prayers. And I'll tell you the simplest and best solution. We should abolish the IRS. We should move to a simple flat tax or a fair tax where every American can fill out his taxes on a postcard. And by the way, and I say this slightly tongue-in-cheek, we should take the 110,000 agents at the IRS and post them all on our southern border. Now, if you think about it, if you were coming and crossing into the country illegally, and you'd had this long, arduous journey, and you crossed the river, and the first thing you see is 110,000 IRS agents, you'd turn around and go home too. And you know, when we talk about the First Amendment, something astonishing happened last week. Something astonishing that almost none of the newspapers covered. The United States Senate voted on a constitutional amendment that was submitted by Senate Democrats that would repeal the free speech protections of the First Amendment. This was stunning. It was extraordinary. I'm the ranking member on the Constitution Subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And we had hearing after hearing after hearing in the Judiciary Committee and the Constitution Subcommittee on this particular provision, a constitutional amendment. This amendment said, for example, it would have added to the Constitution that for any American citizen, Congress can put reasonable regulations on speech. You know what? The First Amendment isn't about reasonable speech. It's about unreasonable speech. And the last people on earth we should want deciding what speech is reasonable and what speech isn't is a bunch of politicians in Washington. You know, it was Congress that thought the Alien and Sedition Acts were reasonable. And the second portion of this constitutional amendment provided that for anything that was organized as a corporation, that Congress could prohibit all political speech. The word prohibit is in the amendment. That would give Congress the explicit power to do so. When we were having the hearings in the Constitution Subcommittee, I asked the chairman, Dick Durbin. You know, he gets that reaction a lot. But I asked him three simple questions. I said, Mr. Chairman, do you think Congress should have the constitutional authority to ban movies? Do you think Congress should have the constitutional authority to ban books? And do you think Congress should have the constitutional authority to ban the NAACP from speaking about politics? And I said, listen, my view on all three questions is absolutely and unequivocally not. Because the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. No law. But under the amendment you've just introduced, with respect to movies, Paramount Pictures is a corporation. Under the text of the amendment you just introduced, what can Congress do to Paramount Pictures? It can prohibit Paramount Pictures from making any movie that criticizes any politician. And by the way, if that seems far-fetched to you, how many of you all have heard of Citizens United? Do you remember the case where the president shamefully attacked the Supreme Court during the State of the Union? A lot of people don't know the facts underlying the case of Citizens United. Citizens United is a nonprofit corporation, and they made a movie that was critical of Hillary Clinton. The Obama administration went after them in court to try to impose both civil fines and criminal penalties for making a movie. That's what the administration has done right now. And by the way, every Democrat who campaigns against Citizens United is saying the government should be able to go after and ban movies. How about the second question I asked? Should the government be able to ban books? Well, you know what? During the oral argument in Citizens United, the Supreme Court asked the Obama administration's lawyer, under your theory, could the federal government ban books? The answer? Yes. I encourage you to go and read the transcript. The Obama Justice Department went before the Supreme Court and argued in favor of banning books. And by the way, I've noted to folks, perhaps you're not inclined to believe me. Perhaps you're skeptical of Republicans, especially conservative Republicans, and perhaps you're just skeptical of all politicians, which frankly is a very good instinct. If that's the case and you're not inclined to believe me on what I say about this amendment, then maybe you would believe that famed right-wing institution, the ACLU. The ACLU submitted a letter in response to this amendment that said this amendment would fundamentally break the Constitution and damage civil rights and civil liberties for generations. And the ACLU is an example. Under this amendment, Congress could ban Hillary Clinton's new book, Hard Choices. That's what the ACLU said in writing. Now, it's interesting. In some crowds, I say that actually gets applause. And I have to point out, there's no reason to ban it. Only 3 people bought the book. And as for the third question about banning the NAACP, the NAACP is a corporation. So is La Raza. So is Planned Parenthood. So is the Sierra Club. So is the AARP. So is People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. Under the text of the amendment, what could Congress do if this became part of the Constitution? Prohibit every single one of them from criticizing or speaking about politics. And by the way, every group I listed is generally associated with being on the left. They tend not to be particular fans of mine. And you know what? They have every constitutional right to stand on the mountaintops and scream their disagreements at the top of their lungs, and I will fight to defend their right to attack me. Although sometimes politics gets curious. The Sierra Club actually put something out saying, "Stop defending us." I'm not making that up. They apparently are perfectly content to hand their free speech right to their friends, the Democrats in Congress. When this went to the floor of the Senate, there are 55 Democrats in the Senate. Do you know how many Democrats voted against this amendment to repeal the free speech protections of the First Amendment? 0. You want to talk about something heartbreaking? Not a single Democrat. I'll tell you, I went to the Senate floor. I quoted, for example, I asked the question, where are the liberals? Russ Feingold, famed lion of the left. When Democrats tried this in 1997, Russ Feingold went to the Senate floor and said, the Bill of Rights is not a rough draft. I quoted another famed right-winger, former Senator Ted Kennedy. When Democrats tried this in 1997, Ted Kennedy went to the floor of the Senate and said, we haven't amended the Bill of Rights in over 200 years, and now is no time to start. I gave the floor speech with a giant picture of Ted Kennedy next to me, and that quote scared the living daylights out of my dad. He turned on the TV and said, what happened to my son? Now, I'll tell you something. We defeated their amendment to repeal the First Amendment. But it is a sad and dangerous thing when the realm of political debate is such that one party has gotten so extreme, the Democratic Party has gotten so hostile to individual liberty, that there is not a single Democrat in the Senate willing to go to the floor of the Senate and say, I support the First Amendment. That's scary. When 55 Democrats think it is good politics to demagogue against the First Amendment. And when, by the way, our friends in the media don't bother to tell anybody about it. I think this should have led the 6 o'clock news every single day. 55 Democrats are coming after the First Amendment. I did in the Judiciary Committee, however, introduce a replacement amendment. An amendment to strike every word from their proposed constitutional amendment and replace it with, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or abridging the free exercise thereof. The amendment I introduced was word for word verbatim the text of the First Amendment to the Constitution. And every single Senate Democrat on the committee voted against the text of the First Amendment to the Constitution. We've got to defend our Constitution. And then, by the way, there are the structural constraints, such as Article 1, Section 8, which limits the powers of Congress. It means Congress doesn't have authority to do things that aren't explicitly enumerated. When I was in high school, I was part of a group called the Constitutional Corroborators. High school kids who studied the Constitution, and we memorized a shortened mnemonic version of the Constitution. TCC, NCC, PCC, Pon, Mama, Ren. Y'all all know what that is, right? That is Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Those are the enumerated powers of Congress. Taxes, credit, commerce, naturalization, coinage, counterfeiting, post office, copyrights, courts, piracy, army, war, navy, militia, money for militia, Washington, D.C., rules, and necessary and proper. Those are the 18 powers the Constitution gives to the Congress of the United States. If it ain't there, Congress can't do it. Now, you will note there was no O for Obamacare. And for that matter, there's no authority either to do what Congress wants to do in the lame duck session, which is to come to the internet and put a sales tax on every transaction on the internet. Let me encourage every one of you, leaders in both houses are planning to come back in December in a lame duck and try to put a sales tax on the internet, and every one of you needs to speak up and stop a tax on the internet. And let me finally talk about matters of war. What ISIS is doing right now is horrific. It is evil. They are crucifying Christians. They are beheading children. They are beheading journalists, American journalists, and threatening to take that war to America. Now, I believe in America's historical reluctance to use military force. But I also believe that ISIS poses a clear and present danger that justifies using force to prevent them from attacking America. But my copy of the Constitution makes very, very clear that it is Congress and only Congress that has the authority to declare war. The President gave an astonishing speech last week, in many respects. but not least of which is where he said, I don't think I need Congress's authority to go to war. But if they want to authorize it, I guess I'll welcome that. You want to talk about an attitude that manifests a contempt for the constitutional limitations on government. Part of the reason the framers gave Congress the authority to declare war is it forces the chief executive, it forces the commander-in-chief to come before Congress and before the American people and to lay out a clear and defined military objective and why, in the President's view, it furthers our U.S. national security interests. That makes it much harder for the President to do what he's doing now, which is get distracted by side issues such as funding rebels in Syria, which makes no sense. These rebels are fighting alongside ISIS. What's happening in Syria is tragic, but it's not the responsibility of our military to resolve that civil war. It is equally ludicrous for the President to say, we will not defend ourselves against ISIS until we achieve political reconciliation between Sunnis and Shiites in Iraq. The Sunnis and Shiites have been engaged in a sectarian civil war since 632 AD. For an American president to believe we're going to go over there and resolve 1,500 years of religious conflict and cause them to throw down their arms and embrace his brothers is the height of hubris and ignorance. The job of the military is singularly focused, or should be singularly focused, on one thing, and that is protecting the national security of the United States of America and protecting the lives of Americans. I want to say finally to y'all, thank you. Thank you for your passion for liberty. The men and women in this room, you have power. You have a voice. You have the ability to speak up, and you have the ability to hold our elected officials accountable, not just for talking a good game. We've all seen politicians who talk a good game, but do they walk the walk? When the fights come, the major fights of the day, when liberty is under assault, do leaders actually stand and defend the Constitution? Or do they hide in the corner and allow liberty to be eroded? If we count on Washington, this fight is hopeless. But I am profoundly optimistic, and it is because of each of you. I am optimistic because I think Americans are waking up all across this country, are realizing our liberty is under assault, are realizing we've got to get back to our Constitution. That's because of what you're doing, and I say simply, thank you and God bless you.